Hello and welcome back to Unearth the Past, a brand new family history and genealogy podcast brought to you by me, Dr. Michala Hume. I am beyond thrilled to say that on this week's podcast, I have got Mr. Workhouse himself, Peter Higginbotham. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I'm a huge fan of yours. No, as you well know. So for those that don't know, me and Peter filmed a show together. It must have been, what was it? A couple of years ago now?
2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, it must have been, mustn't it? Something like that.
Shropshire. Yes.
In Shropshire, yeah. So I got a call asking if I wanted to be the historian, the 19th century sort of specialist on this show. And it was the Great British Dig. And we were doing a workhouse in Oswestry. And I remember chatting to the director on the phone and they said, do you know anybody that specialises in workhouses? I was like, yes. I was like, I do. And I mentioned your name. In my head, I thought, he probably won't do it. He's like Tom Cruise in the in the history world. I thought he's probably like... I've
been compared to Tom Cruise before, but thank you for that.
Thank you. I thought he's probably all booked up. And then when they said you'd agreed to do it, I was so happy. Not only because you are a fabulous historian, but also because I have all your books and I thought I could get them autographed while we were working together, which I did. And I've worked with a lot of people on DNA Journey and obviously a lot of people on the Great British Dig, and I've done Who Do You Think You Are? You and Alan Carr are the only two people that I've ever asked for a selfie with, Peter. So you are definitely up there for me, my friend. Peter, can you explain to the listeners, for those that may not know a lot about workhouses? I mean, for a lot of us here in the UK, and I think maybe in other parts of the world, we grew up knowing about the workhouses because most of us read Oliver Twist.
Yeah.
So that was probably, for most of us, our first kind of introduction to the workhouse and what the workhouses were like. But can you just explain a bit about the history of the workhouses?
Sure. Yeah.
And I suppose that change, in 1834, and I suppose what we think of the Victorian workhouses and what it was like before then.
Yeah, sure. Well, in a kind of funny sort of way, it goes all the way back to Henry VIII, actually. In kind of Tudor times, the religious houses, the monasteries and the abbeys and so on, were one of the really important sources of help for poor, destitute people. And in the 1530s, where Henry VIII dissolved all the religious houses in the country, that removed that support from the country's poor. And as a result of that, there was a huge increase in sort of begging in the streets, and sort of this, particularly in places like London, you couldn't move, for people begging in the streets, and as a result, there was pressure to find an alternative solution. And over the sort of latter half of the 16th century, the solution gradually emerged through various legislative experiments, which really shifted the burden of helping the poor onto the parish. Local householders actually started to be charged what became the rates, as we knew them until not so long ago. Now that's sort of council tax. And in 1601, some of these experiments were crystallised into the 1601 Poor Relief Act, which gave parishes a sort of legal duty to support their poor and destitute inhabitants. And Initially, the way it worked was that there was some parish officials called overseers who collected money from all the parish householders based on the value of their property. So it was a kind of local property tax that funded this. And most of the money in the early days was spent on handouts to people. It could be actual cash, or it could be food, clothing, paying for medical care, and so on. And to qualify for this, you had to sort of demonstrate your poverty, your destitution, and the thing that really introduced the workhouse was the desire to distinguish the deserving poor and the non-deserving poor. And if you were able-bodied and destitute, then you were expected to work in return for a handout. Okay, and this could be done in various ways. Originally, there were sort of non-residential kind of places where you could go and do a day's work and then get a handout and so on. But gradually, residential institutions emerged, really having two functions. They housed the deserving poor who couldn't get by even with the help of a handout. So, the disabled, the elderly, the chronically sick, and so on. And also they were places where the able-bodied poor could go and get free board and lodging, if you like, in return for doing work. So it was twofold: supporting the sort of deserving poor, and places where the able-bodied poor could go and be housed. It took a while for the kind of what we think of as the workhouse to sort of crystallise. It really changed in the 1720s. There was a bit of legislation called the Workhouse Test Act was passed by Parliament, and it formalised some of the sort of the regulations and options for a parish to set up a workhouse, because up to that point it had all been a bit ad hoc and a bit woolly about how it should operate. And in the 1700s, there was a parish workhouse boom. All around the country, parishes were starting to set up workhouses. And the impetus for that was that having a workhouse could save you money. Cool. And the theory was that if you were able-bodied and wanted a handout, then going into workhouse would be bit of a deterrent. So you would actually reduce the number of people claiming poor relief if you made a test of their destitution by offering them the workhouse.
I take it that was with the hope then, Peter, it would push down the poor rate, so exactly. People wouldn't have to pay as much.
Yeah. You would always take care of the sort of the helpless, the blameless poor, but you could sort of put a brake, if you like, on the number of what you might view as sort of layabouts and scroungers who wanted sort of a free ride from the parish, by saying, well, the only way actually we're going to help you is offering the workhouse. No handouts around here anymore. The only way we're going to help people like you is a place in the workhouse where you will expected to work in return for your board and lodging. Unfortunately, because this was a bit sort of fuzzy, each parish could operate things how it wanted. And in some places, actually, workhouses were a bit lax and even attractive to people, because the officials who ran them often changed every year. They had new sort of overseers and so on. And sometimes they just couldn't be bothered actually they collected the money and spent it on the workhouse, but really very kind of rigorous in enforcing the work requirement and so on. So the workhouse was really a part of a bigger system, because the handouts to the what you might call the deserving poor carried on all through this period. A lot of parishes were still giving weekly handouts or ad hoc handouts to the poor, and although there were a large number of parish workhouses, there was always far more money out of the poor rates spent on helping people outside the workhouse.
Yeah.
So if you're doing family history, in fact, the thing that's going to possibly mention your ancestor more often is all the ledgers about people paying into the system and people receiving handouts of various sorts outside the workhouse. We tend to get a bit focused on the workhouse because it's a concrete sort of symbol of the whole system. But the reality was actually, things like old age pensions, were going strong in the 1700s. And you can find in the parish records weekly lists of mostly elderly widows, actually, and they get sort of sixpence a week or one and six a week from the parish, but in their own homes. And in that era, there is actually generally not a lot recorded or that survived that was recorded about the parish workhouse inmates and what they did. So in the 1700s, early 1800s, you're far more likely, say, to find a poor connection, if you like, in the records of the overseers and the parish committee, the vestry, than in any kind of workhouse records.
And they are really interesting records. If you've not checked them out, again, it is a bit of a postcode lottery, as in what records are available, but they are, they're a fascinating set of records, aren't they? The overseers records, and it might even be the fact that the overseer has paid for somebody's shoes. You might find that your ancestor, or it might be that they've chased a man to another parish who needs to come back and pay for his children. They are a really, really interesting set of records, and they do mention, again, often when we think about parish records, we just think about baptisms, burials, and marriages. In the 18th century, but these records they do mention people by name, so you potentially would be able to find an ancestor, and it just gives you a tiny snippet, doesn't it, of what is going on in that village or town at the time.
Things like Mary Smith given sixpence for gin for sitting up all night with a dead body, that's just died, or just as you say, tiny little snippets of parish life. You don't get any other source really, because it's the kind of stuff that was everyday life to them, but nobody thought was worth writing down. In the same way, nobody that I know, has given a sort of detailed description of the experience of going around a supermarket. In 100 years' time, people might say, "Oh, what's these things called supermarkets? How were they organised, and how were they arranged? And how did you get in? And how did you? How did you pay for things? It's kind of all the little fine detail. And of course, these days we have endless. We now have videos and blogs and all sorts of stuff. So it might not actually be quite that difficult in that situation, but transposing it to sort of parish life, just all tiny little juicy fragments of kind of how life was going on.
So let's then pick up on that change. So obviously we've got the 18th century system of poor relief, and as I say, we've got outdoor relief and indoor relief. Predominantly, I think a lot of people were more outdoor relief. And then as we get into the 19th century, we see a real shift, don't we?
We do. And in fact, this has kind of very modern resonances, actually. It's really to do with the welfare bill of the country. Really, at the end of the 18th century, England was actually in a bit of parlous state. In the sort of 1790s, we had a whole series of bad harvests, which caused problems, amongst parish labourers and so on. We had the Napoleonic Wars, which caused a big sort of set of problems for the country. Men going off to war, often not coming back and leaving widows, or coming back injured, disabled, and then claiming poor relief. So between about 1790 and 1820, the cost of poor relief across the country, I think, quadrupled. And the people paying for this, the ratepayers, were starting to get, sort of fairly upset about this. And the Corn Laws, I'm sure everybody remembers from school days, in 1815, pushed up the price of grain, sort of being imported from overseas. And again, that pushed up the price of feeding all these poor relief claimants, because you either give them literally bread or money to buy bread. Um, and eventually, in the early 1830s, the government decided the whole thing needed sorting out. There are also lots of reports of parish uh, poor relief being run very inefficiently, or there was corruption going on. There's always lots, quite a lot of money sloshing through the parish coffers, and there's a lot of room for sort of corruption. Some you get examples of things like people given handouts in the form of vouchers that they had to be spent at certain shops, which just happened to be the brother-in-law of the
Yeah.
overseer, kind of those kind of things, and the system had to be overhauled, but it was really the welfare bill is too high and it needs trimming. So in 1834 we had what was known as the Poor Law Amendment Act, and what that did, it didn't actually change too much, really. It was really just the administrative structure that changed. People, parish householders were still going to pay for this new system, but it was run on what was thought as a more efficient scale. Parishes were grouped together into areas called poor law unions, typically 20 or 30 parishes around a market town. And each poor law union, had a local committee elected by the ratepayers, and each parish in the union would provide typically 1 to 10 guardians, poor law guardians on the board of guardians committee that ran the union, based on the size, the population of each parish. So a big parish, typically the town at the centre, would have maybe 5 or 10 guardians on the board, and the small parishes might just have 1 or 2. So it was locally run, but there was a central body called the Poor Law Commissioners, who kind of oversaw the whole system and churned out rules and regulations. But the kind of underlying thrust of this new system was that from this point on, there would be no handouts whatsoever for able-bodied men and their dependents. So there was still, say, scope for handouts, for people who were poor and sick, or widowed, and so on. But it was intended to be a deterrent system, and the deterrence came in the form of a new flavour of workhouse, which would serve the whole union through a big workhouse and a very strictly run workhouse. It would be off-putting in various ways. The food would be very plain and repetitive. There would be a requirement to work if you were able-bodied in the workhouse, and the new big workhouse buildings would have an enforced system of segregation. If you went into the new workhouse, then men would be in one part of the building, women in the other. The elderly and the able-bodied will be separated, and children will be separated. And that was one of the things that really sort of people hated about the new workhouse system. The sort of the segregation, and families, as soon as they got inside the door of the place, would be separated until they left. I think probably to say, though, that's often the kind of slight misimpression you get is people were sent to the workhouse or put in the workhouse. Strictly speaking, they were offered the workhouse. It's a bit like today. If you're unemployed, you're not forced to claim unemployment benefit. It's there if you want to claim it, but you're not forced to apply for it. So all over the country in the 1830s, these new big workhouses will be put up. In some cases, old existing parish buildings were converted into the new flavour of workhouses, and it was a very strict regime.
I was going to say, in the early years, then what was a typical day like? So if we had just arrived at the
Yeah.
workhouse, Peter, how would that work? I take it the first thing we're going to do is get our uniform as such.
Yeah. Well, in fact, even before that, actually, you didn't typically roll up at the workhouse and knock on the door. In theory, you could do that, but generally, you were dealt with first by the frontline official of the system, the relieving officer, who would interview you and assess your circumstances. And actually, he might potentially give you, say, okay, well, we give you a bit of cash to tide you over or whatever. If you were able-bodied, and he would probably say, well, sorry, all I can offer you is the workhouse. And, if you were happy with that, I'll give you a chitty and you take your family up to the workhouse. If you had a family, you all had to stick together, was the kind of basic expectation. You couldn't just have the husband in the workhouse and the family outside, or if they were outside, they wouldn't get any help. So you all went in together and you all came out together. So you would turn up at the workhouse. In fact, even that would be quite difficult. If you live, you could live possibly 7 or 8 miles from the workhouse, and there wouldn't be a bus or a train in those days. You'd have to make your own way there. Even that actually could be a bit of an ordeal. So you pitch up at the workhouse. There'd be a long admission process. You would have to, there's paperwork to be done. You'd have to have a bath and a medical and make sure you weren't carrying anything infectious. There was kind of a quarantine period,
Yeah, cool.
and smallpox was a really big, serious fear in those days. So you spent a little time in quarantine and had a medical inspection. Your own clothes will be taken off you and either put into store, or if they were too far gone, they'd possibly be burnt. Actually, because a lot of people might actually be in that state. And then you go into the main workhouse, into your separate section, depending on whether you were elderly, able-bodied, and so on. And from that point on, it was a fairly sort of rigid routine. It differed a bit whether you were able-bodied or sort of elderly and infirm. But able-bodied, typically you'd be up at sort of 6 in the morning. You'd have roll call and breakfast. 7 till 12, you'd be working, an hour off for your dinner, another 5 hours work in the afternoons, 1 till 6, dinner in the supper in the evening, and you'd be in bed by 8 o'clock. Some places it could be even earlier. Some places actually resented buying candles in the when it got dark, so you kind of went to bed when it was dark. Sunday was a bit different. Sunday was the day of rest. No sort of labour required, but you had lots of sort of religious activities provided. It'd be a chapel service, a church service in the morning, Sunday school in the afternoon for the children, another sort of service in the evening. So lots of religious devotions were expected of you. So that was the basic routine. Food was again a very.
I was going to say, what are we eating, Peter? Because I know, didn't you do a cookbook? Am I right?
Yeah, no, I did actually. I actually came into possession of an original Workhouse cookbook, which sounds like one of those humorous.
I was going to say, I couldn't imagine there was many recipes in it, but I'm sure you're going to tell me that there is.
Oh, well, it was quite. I think about 50 odd recipes. Well, in fact, the real thing to be aware of, or always consider when you're talking about the workhouse, is it changed over the decades.
It did.
It's very easy to read Oliver Twist and think, oh well, I say it was in 1920. I'm sure, because that's what Charles Dickens says. It changed enormously, and in fact, this very strict regime really covered up to the 1870s. So 1830s to 1870s, you had this very, very strict regime, which really what I've just described. So for that period, the food was, I say, very plain. It would be sort of porridge, gruel, or bread for breakfast and for supper, or possibly bread and cheese. Very fixed amounts. 8 ounces of bread and 6 ounces of gruel or whatever. Half a pint of gruel. Uh, the midday dinner was the main thing that changed a bit. Typically, 4 or 5 days a week, it was things like bread and broth, or suet pudding. On a couple of days, you would get meat and veg. Um, but it was very stodgy. But again, you always have to compare what's happening in the workhouse to what's happening outside the workhouse to similar kind of people. If you've watched any of these TV series reconstructing life in Victorian times, you know that people are scraping halfpennies and pennies together to buy a bit of bread for their family. So although the workhouse food was very plain, at least it was three solid meals a day.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, life, especially in these rural towns and villages, especially if work is agricultural, which it mostly is, it's seasonal.
Yeah, exactly.
We found that when we did our research for oswestry.
Yeah.
That for some people, the workhouse, it meant fresh clothes, it meant food.
Yeah.
You didn't have to go out and try and get it. It was there.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting what you said about how the workhouse changed. And I think we found that, didn't we, with oswestry, when we did our research there, that yes, there is a routine that is followed, but there was also provision. I remember there was like a heating system. Do you remember they tried to sort of introduce a kind of heating system?
Yeah.
And a band came in. Do you remember? And I think somebody came in and did a play. So I think exactly what you said. And I remember us having a discussion about this, because often when we think of the workhouse, we think of Oliver Twist. And it was like that in some workhouses for most of the 19th century. But as you've rightly said, we do get a shift, a change.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I certainly Oliver Twist. If I remember, the diet in the Oliver Twist workhouse was gruel, and gruel, and
that was it.
an onion once a week or something.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was never ever a real workhouse that I've ever come across that had that as the diet. In fact, the Oliver Twist workhouse was a parish workhouse. Even though Oliver Twist was written after the new system had come into operation, the story actually reflects a parish workhouse. But there was some change. One of the big changes, which kind of is quite significant as far as family history is concerned, is to do medical care. Up until the 1860s, 70s, the workhouse was probably the least attractive place in the world to get sick. Every workhouse had a facility called an infirmary, but they're often tiny, badly ventilated, cramped, very, very, very minimal. The workhouse had a doctor, but most of the nursing was done by elderly female inmates, who kind of volunteered or press ganged into doing the work. And a lot of them, were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. Certainly couldn't read a label on the bottle or read some instructions left by the medical officer. And often they were drunk most of the time. Seriously. They often got given a ration of beer in the morning, for doing the job, and kind of by about 8 o'clock in the morning, they'd be rolling around, sort of, and sometimes.
Let's hope they know the difference between arsenic and something else.
A lot of the stuff that in those days that was prescribed for people in the infirmary, were alcohol-based, like brandy, for example.
Yeah.
The reason for that is that often the drugs, or any drugs prescribed by the medical officer, had to be paid for out of his salary. However, if you prescribed things like brandy or beer to the sick, that came out of the food bill rather than out of his pocket. It was quite attractive, actually, to provide alcohol-based stimulants. They were often referred to as. Sort of because the patients were quite happy, it made them feel better, and it didn't dig into the poor doc's salary. But a lot of the medical care was very dodgy, you might say. Trained paid nurses were very, very rare until the 1860s. There was a big outcry in the 1860s in London because the medical journal The Lancet did lots of sort of on the spot exposés of some of the really dire conditions. As a result of that, there were really big push to improve workhouse medical care, and that kind of filtered across the country. But the thing that really changed was that from the 1870s onwards, roughly, if you were sick and poor, but not so poor you needed to go into the workhouse, but you just couldn't afford a doctor, you would increasingly be referred to the workhouse infirmary for care and treatment. So you would be in the workhouse infirmary not because you were ultra poor, because it effectively become the local hospital in many cases. So my great great grandfather, for example, I know from the census that not that long before he died in the workhouse infirmary, he was at home with his family, apparently living okay. But he died in the workhouse infirmary. I suspect, I don't know because the records haven't survived, that he went into the workhouse infirmary very close to the end of his life because his family couldn't really care for him anymore. And that was really the only option, the only alternative form of care that existed in those days. There were things called voluntary hospitals, charity hospitals, but they didn't touch the elderly or chronic cases. If you were elderly and needed elderly and poor and needed care, the workhouse infirmary had effectively become the local hospital or hospice, almost you might say. So a lot of people died in workhouse infirmaries.
I was going to say, yeah, I know my great grandfather, he died in the workhouse infirmary. And I know that there's going to be people listening whose relatives, ancestors have died in a workhouse infirmary. So it's interesting that you've actually brought that up and sort of clarified, I think, for most of us that, that these people weren't necessarily inmates of the workhouse and they've got sick there. They were probably just ill, couldn't afford a doctor. And therefore, like what you said, that was the local hospital for poor people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you might find, that people appear in workhouse infirmary records, but not in the sort of the general workhouse admission records. But yes, so it may not be the sort of quite such a depressing discovery if you're in that situation as it might initially seem to be. That really they were just making use of the only provision that existed for poorer people in those days, particularly in terms of end of life care. But just to follow on from that, really, that as a result of all this extra business, if you like, the workhouse infirmary, there was a big expansion of workhouse medical facilities, and in case lots of new buildings, and in some cases the kind of the medical provision, particularly in the larger sort of town city workhouses, almost outgrew the care for the basic poor. If you look at the old maps of the Ordnance Survey maps of workhouse sites, all the new expansion around the original workhouse is often hospital blocks, and that is really why eventually workhouse infirmaries became largely hospitals. And in 1948, when the NHS was launched, a very big proportion of NHS real estate was what was former workhouse sites, which had morphed into hospitals for the poor.
How did the treatment of children change, Peter, over this period? From obviously when I know with my historian's hat on, if we start at the beginning of the 19th century, children are very much seen as mini adults. They are there to help provide and put food on the table, and they're sent out to work. So how did, as we get sort of education acts introduced as the 19th century progresses, how did that reflect in the treatment of children within the workhouse?
Well, surprisingly, children actually, on the whole, were the one group that were treated more amenably by the system than the adults. Really, as early as the 1840s, there were attempts being made to get children out of workhouses into separate accommodation. So children with who'd entered the workhouse system with their parents, they were increasingly housed on a separate site. The belief was that if children were mixing with adult paupers, they would pick up bad habits, bad ways. They'd be tainted, was the phrase that was sometimes used, by being exposed to adults in workhouses. So originally, the 1840s onwards, there were what were called district schools being set up in some places, particularly in London and some of the big northern cities, Manchester, Leeds, and Liverpool had the quite big schools where children were taken from the workhouse into what I suppose you would call the workhouses for children. They were quite, monolithic, big buildings, and the children there, were given educated. They were also given what was called industrial training, trying to equip them for later life. So for the girls, it was domestic training. They were expected to end up as domestic servants, so they were taught, the basics of cookery, sewing, cleaning, all those kind of things. And the boys were taught various sort of manual crafts, carpentry, tailoring, shoemaking, all those kind of things. And the hope was that if you gave them those skills, when they reached 15 or whatever, left the workhouse, they would be employable, and therefore they wouldn't turn into paupers like their parents had done. These district schools, which are also known as barrack schools, by people who thought they were not such a good thing, they were succeeded in the 1870s, 1880s by a whole new system inherited from Europe, actually, called the cottage homes system. The idea was that children, rather than being in these massive institutions, really needed to be in a more family-style environment. So cottage homes, villages, as they were usually known, were literally mini villages, often out, in the countryside. And typically there'd be, I don't know, say a dozen or 15 quotes cottages, usually quite substantial houses, each of which would have 15 or 20 children living there under the care of either a house mother or house parents, usually the case with boys. And they would be, they'd have a school, they'd have a chapel, they'd have workshops, basically like self-contained little villages. They'd have a bakery, a laundry, and so on. And again, a lot of the work of running the place would be done by the older children. So the laundry, would have the girls helping there, and the boys, I say, would be doing the carpentry, shoemaking, or whatever. And I say quite a few of these were set up. Some are actually still around. Actually, again, it's always interesting to go and find the buildings and wander around, because they were quite well constructed buildings and often now quite desirable residences. Usually set around a nice village green style setup. Cottage homes, in their turn, started to get criticised in the 1890s as being a bit sort of Never Never Land, although they had good aims. They weren't really equipping children for real sort of life, particularly city life. They weren't becoming streetwise. The idea was modified, starting in Sheffield, but again spread around the country, of having the same style of family little groups, 15, 20 children under the care of house parents, but in a house, an ordinary house in a city suburb. So big cities, like Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, and so on. Around the outskirts of the city, there were dotted these scattered homes, as they were known. The children went to local schools and really mixed in. And the idea was that they would be better equipped in that situation. So some poor law unions adopted the cottage home system, and some adopted the scattered home system. Some had sort of kind of hybrid systems, and so on. It varied quite a bit around the country, but generally, the children, were taken out of the horrors, if you like, of the workhouse, and given relatively comfortable and well-educated upbringings. Again, you always have to compare it what's going on outside. So even with the 1870, Education Act and its successors and so on, a lot of children, outside the workhouse were living in quite sort of, a degree of poverty, and completely free education, public education, as they didn't come in until the late 1880s, I think, if I remember rightly. So children, in the workhouse system, actually, arguably fared reasonably well compared to a lot of children outside. They say really the one group that you could say had in its own way a positive outcome from their time in the poor relief system.
Now, you've mentioned how people went into the workhouse and the process of how people got admitted into the workhouse. How did people get out then?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Well, in the same way that you weren't forced into the workhouse, you weren't forced to stay there if you did go into the workhouse. You could leave any time you wanted, was the theory. In fact, you couldn't just waltz out the door anytime you want, because if you left a workhouse site wearing your workhouse clothing without permission, you were stealing workhouse property.
Yeah.
So there was quite a sort of subtle control over people's movements, and if you were guilty of that, you could get a month's hard labour. So it was quite sort of a useful way of controlling. You had to give notice of your intention to discharge yourself. Is kind of probably how you would phrase it in a formal way. Typically 3 hours notice, so that gave the workhouse master or matron time to go and dig out your clothing, do the necessary paperwork, and you would then be reunited with your family if that was the case, and you would then go on your way. But it's essentially, you could leave any time you wanted, and in fact, some people took full advantage of that. There was an interesting group of people known as the ins and outs, who treated the workhouse like a sort of free DOS house, really. They would, come in on a Monday, go through all the admission procedure, and by Wednesday they'd be fed up with the place, and they'd discharge themselves, spend a couple of nights outside somewhere, either sleeping rough, or it might be a relative they could sponge on for a couple of days. On Friday morning they'd be back on the workhouse sort of doorstep again. Going round and round, and it eventually became such a problem for the workhouse officials having to do all this admission procedure, discharge procedure, admission procedure, discharge procedure. They actually got the power to detain people. It's one of the few instances where the workhouse could detain people if they discharged themselves, recently and come back straight in again. But generally, I say you could leave anytime you wanted.
How did you get interested in workhouses? What is the connection that led you to just have this amazing database?
Well, I was doing my family history, believe it or not, and sending off for certificates. And I sent off for the death certificate of my great-great-grandfather, Timothy. Timothy Higginbotham. His spelling's sort of changed over the years. It's sort of various, times as they do. And it had his place of death as the Birmingham Workhouse Infirmary. I thought, workhouse. I've vaguely heard of workhouses. I wonder what that's all about. So I looked around, and we're talking about 1992 now. Quite a long time ago now, and there didn't seem to be very much around, actually. The only thing I could find, there was a lovely book by a gentleman called Norman Longmate, called The Workhouse, and a lovely book. And I thought, okay. But it didn't really I mean, it's a great book, but it doesn't really go in much into sort of the sort of what you might call the sort of family history, so much kind of stuff, or into the sort of buildings. And it kind of gave the impression that all the buildings were sort of long gone, like Stonehenge almost. It's all the distant past. And I kind of got, looked around a bit more when there was a lovely program on. I was off work one day and watching daytime TV, and there was this little half-hour documentary made by ATV, as it was in those days, about the Birmingham workhouse. I think they were about to knock it down, and they sneaked inside and done some filming. And I always wanted to see this again, actually, sort of as time has gone on. And that kind of got me more interested. The thing, though, that really took it to a whole new level was that in 1999, English Heritage, or the National Monuments Record, I think it was called then, they were doing a project documenting old hospitals that were all being knocked down all over the country. And someone there sort of spotted that a lot of these hospital buildings had originally been workhouses, and they actually spun off a really interesting project. And there was a book came out of this by a lady called Catherine Morrison, and it kind of laid out the whole history of workhouses, really from an architectural point of view, but woven in with lots of other stuff, really going back to sort of 17th century, really 1600s. And in the back of this book, there was a list of every workhouse in the country, and exactly, it's kind of grid reference. And I thought, oh, wow. Oh, and also you could go to the National Monuments Archives in Swindon, and each of these places, they'd compiled a little dossier because Catherine Morrison and her colleagues have been round a lot of these workhouses and taken pictures and got the plans and written on the plans. This used to be the mortuary or the dining hall or whatever. And suddenly this brought this to life. There are all these buildings, and a lot of them obviously still standing. And I thought, oh wow, I could actually go to places like Birmingham and actually see the place where my great-great-grandfather ended up. Which is exactly what Who Do You Think You Are and programs like that do. They take you to the actual places. It brings it all to life. So I started, sort of with these list of places, and I'm going to. I used to go to Swindon to the archives, the English Heritage Archives, and every week order up about 20 of these dossiers. I mean, really, some of them were really thick. It took me all day on a Saturday, and I kind of they got to know me, and I used to be called the Workhouse Man. I sort of, oh, he's here again, the Workhouse Man. All this stuff, and I started going around the country like they had, and in fact some of them they hadn't been to, and it was just amazing. I say you could literally, with this stuff, you could stand in front of all these places and say, oh, that was the women's side, and that was the dining hall, and that was the refractory cell where they sort of stuff the miscreants for a day or two, and it was just like living history. I thought, well, this is wonderful, and I was taking photos, so I thought, because I worked in IT at the time, I thought, workhouses were just, websites were just starting to proliferate. I thought I could actually make a little workhouse website. So first of all, I was living in a place called Abingdon, which had a workhouse. In fact, when I was just getting going, I went to the local library in Abingdon and said, what have you got on the workhouse? And they said, oh, the workhouse. Ooh. And they fished around and they brought out this press cutting of Christmas dinner in the workhouse in 1883. And that was it. And I thought, there was this enormous building, housed 300 people or thereabouts. It'd been there for the best part of a century. And, it's virtually unrecorded. They had books on the abbey and the parish church and the railway, the defunct railway and the the river and the pond, anything you think of, almost had been lovingly documented, apart from the workhouse. And I thought, oh, that's very strange.
Why do you think
So
that? I was going to say, why do you think that was then, Peter? Do you think it was because people weren't that interested in the workhouse at
yes,
that time?
yeah. In fact, yeah. If you mention this to people, you're interested in the workhouse, they say, "Oh, why on earth do you want to know about the
Mm.
workhouse? Oh, horrible places,
Mm.
best forgotten." Um, I always think it's a bit like showing an interest in the local, VD clinic or something. They would say,
Yeah.
"My God, why on earth would you want to know about that place?" Oh gosh. Um, I kind of,
Listen, I research cemeteries, right? So I totally understand where you're coming from. I get people all the time going to me, why are you a historian of death? Why are
yeah,
you, so who wants
yeah,
to know about
yes,
death?
yes. Yes, I think people just look at me like as if I was a bit, off the wall, sort of.
Mm.
It's like showing. I say it's just really weird. How could you possibly be into this rather disgusting, whole thing? Anyway, so I thought, okay, well, I'll start off. I'll do a little web page about the Abingdon Workhouse,
Mm.
and I visited a few more in the area, sort of Oxfordshire, Berkshire, and I thought, oh, I could extend this to Oxfordshire, have half a dozen web pages, and then it kind of became I would say an obsession, but a passion, I think is the word. So I went further and further afield, and eventually I almost got the whole of England. And I thought, well, Wales, be interesting. I spent a couple of weekends going around Wales, and then Scotland. They're a slightly different system. They're poor houses and in a slightly different administration. And then Ireland, of course. So eventually, over the years, they end up, sort of really going the whole British Isles, from Shetland down to Cornwall and west of Ireland over to East Anglia. And it kind of every time found a new location and visited, it was always a great pleasure to see this really interesting building looming up, that was possibly a hospital annex, or so, been turned into something. Most of the people there had no idea what it, had once been. And, you know, and actually I thought, well, let's put this all together into a website. And that's kind of really how it grew. It kind of grew like Topsy, as they say. And then it moved on to the more historical little parish workhouses, not so well sort of documented, a bit hard to sort of track down quite often.
So
So that's it, really.
how many, I don't know if you're going to know this, so how
Yeah.
many workhouses have you now got on your website?
Well,
And a guess.
I don't know. Well, in the Victorian era, there were sort of 600 and odd.
Mm.
What we think of as the big Victorian workhouse.
Yeah.
Prior to that, there were hundreds and hundreds of little parish
Mm.
workhouses. Um, yeah, I mean, some of those, you just know they existed. That's all you know,
Of course.
is that there once was, a parish house in Little Fiddleton or whatever. Sometimes you know a bit more, when it was opened, or in some cases it may still be there, and you can go and see it. Sometimes they even have a little plaque on the wall, or a kind of memorial stone, when it was set up. If for some reason, that's been put into place. Um, I've certainly a couple of thousand, I suppose.
Easy.
Yeah, yeah.
If
But
you haven't, by the way, checked out Peter's website, workhouses.org.uk, isn't it, Peter? I think at the end.
that's exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah, .org.uk. Honestly, you must check it out. I know for a fact if you have an ancestor that has been in a workhouse, I guarantee you have been on Peter's website. You may not have known it was Peter's website, but let me tell you, you have been on Peter's website. It is so packed full of information about workhouses. There's even a quiz on there. I will wrap it up now because I've noticed that we're just getting towards the hour mark. But I do have my final question, and it's the question that I ask all my guests when they come on the show, Peter.
right.
If you could invite somebody around for dinner tonight, either
Yes.
somebody from your family history or somebody you've researched, who would it be and why? And what would you cook?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I suppose one character who always kind of leaps out at me in the history, which I actually did some work on recently for another kind of project, was Dr. Joseph Rogers, who was the medical officer of the Strand Workhouse on Cleveland Street in London. That particular one is got a strong association with Charles Dickens, who lived, about 5 doors away for part of his youth, and it's often said that's the workhouse it was based on. But Joseph Rogers, first of all, he's got one of the few detailed accounts of workhouse experiences in his autobiography, which was published after he died, actually. But and his encounter in battles with the workhouse master and the board of guardians trying to improve the place. When he arrived, it was a terrible state. As I mentioned, the drunken nurses. They had carpet beating going on outside the windows of all the wards, creating dust and noise. There was a huge laundry in the basement, producing lots of smells and and he was very instrumental, actually, in these changes in the 1860s I mentioned about improving the life of workhouse inmates. And his battles with the workhouse master really an awful ex-policeman called George Catch makes fascinating readings. I'd love to sort of hear more about that. What I'd cook him? Oh, that's a good question. Well, I suppose I'm vegetarian, actually, so I'm not sure what he might find. I'd probably dig up my workhouse cookbook and say, try some of these more interesting things. After the diet improved enormously in the early 1900s, there's a pudding I've made a couple of times as a demonstration thing called golden pudding, which is like a sort of a sponge pudding flavored with ginger and golden syrup and treacle, and we could relive the workhouse experience with a plateful of golden pudding.
Peter, thank you so much. Peter Higginbotham, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Honestly, I am, one of your biggest fans, as I've already mentioned.
Oh, thank you, Michala. It's been, as you know, I love talking about the workhouses. And I see you've got one of my books to mention. One thing I always have to say is that the books always contain more that's on the website. People always think it's just the book on the website, but there's always a lot more research in the books than is on the website.
So I remember many years ago, you wrote an almanac, of the workhouse, and I wrote a grim almanac of Manchester, and they're actually in the same series. So,
yeah, that was full of interesting tales. I always remember the one about the lady who in the bed in the workhouse, who was being regularly brought sort of supplies of laudanum and opium by people sneaking it and just smuggling it into the workhouse. And again, it's interesting. One thing I know we've passed our time, but I just want to say anyway. There's the thing I would always try and remind people is that workhouse inmates were a community of living people who used to kind of try and undercut the system and break the rules and it's a fascinating sort of community to look at, actually. And again, smuggling illicit goods into the workhouse was one of the sort of things they got up to, and all sorts of men and women sneaking over the wall at midnight to have little assignations, and it would make a wonderful soap opera.
I know, I must admit, you've sold it really well, Peter. I think if I had my time again, you stick me in the workhouse. If you do want to see our episode of The Great British Dig at Oswestry Workhouse, I will check. The new series of The Great British Dig is on now. In fact, tell a lie, it's actually just finished. But if you've missed it, I know you can get it on Channel 4's version of catch up. I will see if the Oswestry one is still available, and if it is, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Thank you very much for listening. Apologies that this week's podcast is slightly late. I normally try and get them out on a Monday, but this was most definitely worth the wait. Thank you very much for listening, folks, and I shall see you again next week.